I'm trying out a new segment called You Asked For It. And it's basically where I answer some of your questions. For future videos, I'm going to try and answer a few different questions in the same video. But this first one, it really got me scratching my head, so I thought I better just do this as a dedicated video. It's from ScoMo111. Hi Brett, so I sold my trusty Pajero and I'm looking at upgrading and essentially have narrowed it down to this or the MV Triton GSR. This question was posted on the 2024 Isuzu D-Max facelift detailed review video. So it's referring to either the Triton or the new D-Max. Having driven both of these and tested them both on and off road, for your money, which would be sitting in your driveway? My first question to ScoMo111 is, what is your top priority? And I think that makes a big difference in your car buying decision. For example, if you're doing a lot of towing, I think that changes things quite a bit between even these two vehicles. If you're doing a lot of off-roading, then again, I think that changes quite a bit as well. But let's go into some of the key specs and just try to narrow it down a bit. Firstly, the engine. So it's a 3-litre in the D-Max versus a 2.4 in the Triton. Power and torque are very different. So the D-Max is 140 kilowatts and 450 newton meters. And then the new Triton is 150 kilowatts and 470 newton meters. So that's more power and torque from the smaller engine. But if you're doing a lot of towing, for example, sometimes capacity is more important than power and torque because that can help with engine braking. The larger the pistons, the more compression, and it helps to slow down the vehicle without having to rely on the brakes. And even, using the gears to slow down and things. That's where I think the D-Max really edges ahead from a lot of its rivals because it has that large capacity engine. Ford has the V6 version, which is same sort of thing, so you're still going to have that same compression effect. It's just divided up into 6 pistons instead of 4. It doesn't really make much difference if you really calculated that out. There might be a bit of a difference, but that's still better than 2.4 in the Triton, in my opinion. But then if we look at the specs a bit closer, so 450 newton meters in the D-Max, that's available from 1600 to 2600. That's a 1000 RPM window. Whereas in the Triton, you get that little bit more torque, but it's available between 1500 and 2750 RPM. So that's a 1250 RPM window. Doesn't sound like much, but when you're in a diesel where you're not really revving it right out, you're not going through this 2000 all the way up to 5500 RPM, you're just using a very small window anyway. 1250 RPM is a nice size window, so you always got plenty of torque on hand pretty much from any RPM. And starting from 1500, that's not far off idle basically, so straight away you've got that torque there. Now this is a pretty new engine. Mitsubishi says it's kind of all new, but there are some carryover parts like the block and so on, bits and pieces of the dimensions and things, but it is pretty much all new, I guess. It does have a twin turbo setup now rather than a single turbo setup. That means it is a bit more complex, but it does help to produce those higher outputs. It also helps with efficiency. So I'm just looking here. The official rating of the D-Max is 8 litres per 100, which is pretty good. That's not bad for a 3-litre diesel. Some of these newer Utes that are coming out from the emerging markets, like the Chinese and so on, they're above 8, 8.5, 9 litres per 100. So 8 is pretty good for a 3-litre fairly old school sort of unit. It's Euro 5, so it's still quite old, whereas the Triton is now past Euro 6. It does require AdBlue, the Triton, so you do have to consider that. It sounds like a big pain in the ass, but I don't think it's that big of a deal if you just carry some AdBlue in your car all the time. Like most petrol stations have it as well, so it's not a huge deal, but it is something to consider. But the Triton is 7.7 litres per 100 kilometres. Despite the AdBlue and the twin turbo and the smaller capacity, the emissions output isn't actually that different. Not that it probably matters to you if you're buying one as an individual, but if you're buying it on fleet or something like that as a company car, emissions do come into the criteria of what you're allowed to have. Usually fleet companies are at 200 grams maximum. The Triton is 203, so you might be able to sneak through that if you're good with your manager and all that sort of thing. And the D-Max is 207 grams per kilometre. But still, they're very, very close. What that means for touring, the D-Max comes with a 76-litre tank and the Triton comes with a 75-litre tank. That translates to a theoretical average range, so that's taking the official average and just using their fuel tank, full fuel tank, and then just calculating what the theoretical kind of range would be. It doesn't mean this, you'll get this in the real world. You might get more, you probably get a bit less. But 950 kilometers in the D-Max and 974 in the Triton. Again, very similar. But yeah, you do have to factor in that you've got to put AdBlue in the Triton. So that, it does bump up the cost just a little bit. Okay, let's pick a winner of the powertrain. I think if you're towing, definitely the D-Max, or not definitely, but the D-Max stands out for me. Just because it is that bigger capacity, I don't think you need to push it as hard to get the most out of it. In other words, I think the Triton is more complex. It does produce more power and torque, but it does it in a more complex way. And straight away that tells me that you're probably going to be pushing it a bit more if you need to tow something regularly. If you're not towing regularly, I don't think this is an issue at all. In terms of performance, the D-Max is a little bit quicker. I've timed 0 to 100 in about 9.5 seconds, whereas in the new Triton, I did it in 10.40 seconds. That was on sort of a back road out in the middle of nowhere, but it was a flat road, so I can imagine getting similar sort of time out on the private road or a bit more of a controlled conditions. But in saying that, I do find the Triton engine more interesting. Now, I don't know if this is an important factor for you, but it is for me when I'm looking at cars. If I've got a 2-litre naturally aspirated engine versus a 1.6 turbo, I'll always give the 1.6 turbo some credit just because it is more interesting. So when you're driving it, it just has a slightly different sound. It's got the turbocharger, so it's a bit more bassy usually, and it's just more interesting. I don't know. It makes you want to drive it slightly more than the one that doesn't have that. So to me, the Triton engine is more interesting, and I'd feel more interested in driving it just because of that. Even if it's just a smidge, I don't know if that's important to you. I would give it a bit of credit just for being a twin turbo 2.4 litre. It's also a little bit quieter actually. I will give it that, because it's a smaller capacity engine. Those big pistons in the D-Max do rattle around a bit. They have refined it over the years and made some improvements, but it's still definitely sort of one of the noisier ones. Once you're driving on the highway and everything, it's totally fine. It's just when it's cold and when you're driving in, very slow conditions, you just can feel and hear that it is a diesel engine. Whereas the Triton, you could be humming along the highway, and if you didn't know much about cars, or not too much, you could easily mistake it for just a petrol engine. You don't really notice the difference. So in that sense, yeah, the Triton wins some points in terms of refinement, I think. What would I pick? What engine would I pick? As a workhorse, I'd pick the D-Max engine. It's been around for a bit longer. They haven't fiddled with it too much. This new Triton engine hasn't been around for that long in twin turbo configuration. Are there going to be problems with it? Probably not. We'll get to warranty in a second as well. Yeah, it's a really hard decision. It really is. I think it comes down to towing pretty much, and that's about it. If you're not towing, then this becomes more difficult. But if you are towing, then I reckon sway more towards the D-Max. Let's get into the next bit here. We've got dimensions and off-road sort of capabilities. The D-Max has 240 millimeters of ground clearance, while the Triton has 228. That's a pretty big difference. But I don't think that it makes a big difference when you're actually out in the field. I think that measurement would be taken from the diff. So if you're clearing things, or if you're in a common track or something like that, or going over mounds and things, the diff doesn't really matter because the wheels, it's connected to the wheels. But if you are going in those tracks where both left and right fall into a deep track, and then the middle is scraping along, then that's definitely important. Your approach angle is 27 degrees in the D-Max, and then 30 degrees in the Triton. So the Triton wins that just by a little bit. And then the breakover angle is 23.8 versus 23.4, basically the same thing. And the departure angle is 19 degrees in the D-Max and 22.8 in the Triton. The Triton no longer has that massive overhang at the rear from the previous generation. And yeah, now 23 or near 23 degrees. That's good. 19 is, it's getting down there. But that's probably because the X-Terrain comes with a tow bar as standard, I'm pretty sure. So that's probably factoring in that's what's the first thing you're going to snag. That doesn't really matter. So off the road, the Triton definitely has the better running gear, in my opinion. The Super Select 2, it's got a proper center differential, locking center differential as well, and a locking diff. So does the D-Max. But that that hardware is definitely better than the Triton setup. It's a mechanical advantage for sure, because you can put it in all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive and drive it on the tarmac. It doesn't matter. It's got a differential. In other words, it can separate the wheel speeds from front to rear. So you can turn corners and things and won't wind up the gearing and everything. The D-Max doesn't come with anything like that. Once you put it in four-wheel drive, that's it. The front and rear are essentially locked. They're not, but that's kind of how it works. The D-Max comes with a new feature called rough terrain mode. Now, what this is, essentially what I see it as, the biggest benefit is that it's a traction control system for when the rear diff is locked. Usually in most Utes, as soon as you lock the diff, all the stability and everything turns off. It has to, because you can't have, left and right axles locked together and then stability control or braking pressure being applied to one of the wheels. The locking mechanism is going to push through that braking system. So it's going to snap an axle, because you've got braking pressure on one side, so it wants to stop the wheel spinning, but because the axle's locked, it wants to keep spinning. So you're going to have two opposing pressures, basically. So you can't have that. You can actually engage rough terrain mode regardless of the driving mode. So you can be in two-wheel drive or four-wheel drive. That doesn't actually matter, but I see the biggest benefit when you have the rear diff locked. So what it does is, say you're going over some moguls or something like that, and you're getting some diagonal wheels coming off the ground. The front wheel comes off the ground. The rear diff's locked. It can still spin away power to one separate front wheel, even though the rear diff is locked. With this rough terrain mode engaged, it'll apply stability or traction management to that front wheel. So it will put the brakes on a little bit to slow down the spinning of that front wheel. So it will help you get through. I don't think it's as good as a locking differential. I think mechanical traction is better than any electronic system out there, in my opinion and in my experience. This is if you're really serious about off-roading, by the way. This is if you're, going through some rough dirt roads and stuff, both of these vehicles will get you through no problem anyway. But yeah, if you really want to hone right down in on the specifics, the Triton will get you a bit further, because you can lock that center diff. And I think having the ability to drive with four-wheel drive engaged on any surface, that's a big plus. You could be in really, torrential rain or something like that. You can just engage four-wheel drive and still drive on the highway and definitely get a bit more stability compared with something that's just rear-wheel drive. You've got the ground clearance with the D-Max, but the rest of the package wins for the rest of the package of the Triton wins, in my opinion. The four-wheel drive system, the Super Select, is just far superior to what the D-Max offers. So next up, we're talking about towing. Both are rated at 3.5 tons. I'm a bit sort of over the manufacturers just aiming for this 3.5 ton magic number when there are other numbers that are more important. And I don't think just slapping on 3.5 tons means, it's safe or recommended to tow 3.5 tons. They're just meeting the maximum legal limit in Australia for a passenger vehicle. Anyway, let's just zoom in on the specs here. Starting with the D-Max. The curb weight is 2,170 kilograms, and the gross combination mass, which is probably the most important number of all, that's the weight of everything that's possible on that vehicle. Towing, trailer, gear, passengers, everything. It's rated at 6,000 kilograms on the D-Max X-Terrain automatic. Now, get that 6,000 figure, minus 2,170 kilograms, minus 3,500 kilograms, you're left with 330 kilograms for anything else. So passengers, cargo, anything else. That's not a very big figure, in my opinion, and in my experience with these Utes and things. And as you'll see in a second, it doesn't stack up well against the Triton. The Triton weighs 2,115 kilograms. Its gross combination mass is 6,250 kilograms. So it's a slightly lighter vehicle, and the GCM is 250 kilograms higher. As you can probably imagine, the leftover mass is much higher. So 635 kilograms of leftover. That's much more like it. You can tow 3.5 tons, although I wouldn't recommend it. You can tow 3.5 tons, stack in a bunch of people, 635 kilograms worth of people, basically, or 400 kilograms worth of people and their gear. That's a good combination. That's a good limit to have. That's a good threshold to have left over. If you're looking to tow something really, really heavy, I think the Triton, in terms of the legal limits, I think the Triton does actually come up better. So the engine in the D-Max might be better for towing, but these figures for these variants anyway don't stack up well for the D-Max. And then lastly, I'm just going to quickly talk about on the road. The D-Max does feel quite like an SUV. It's easy to drive. It doesn't feel like a truck. You can see out of it very easily. A lot of the controls are conventional and simple. So you're not going to get confused while you're driving it. You know, your wife or your grandma or anybody could drive it pretty easily. It doesn't come with some of the advanced safety systems that are coming out on new models. And in fact, it doesn't need to have a driver monitoring camera. So I don't know if you've seen these, but they're so annoying. They're probably the worst invention on modern cars, in my personal opinion. I absolutely hate them. Not because they're annoying and they sort of piss me off while I'm driving, but because I just think they're redundant. They don't do anything. If I'm falling asleep behind the wheel and that thing flashes at me, it's flashed at me while I'm checking the touch screen. So why would it wake me up while I'm falling asleep? You know, it's you're desensitized from it straight away. But it's so annoying that you turn it off. You want to turn it off or put tape over it or something, then it's not doing anything anyway. So they're just ridiculous systems, and I'm not criticizing the Triton for this. All models will have this. Sorry, all brand new models have to have this to pass 5-star ANCAP rating. It's just another stupid ANCAP rule that's come out without thinking about it. They don't think of the real world sort of implications of some of these technologies. To me, if you want to make a vehicle safe, make everyone wear a harness and make everyone wear a helmet, like they do down at the kids' go-kart system. Like it's pretty simple. But anyway, these safety systems are not introduced into the latest D-Max because it doesn't need them. It's still an existing model, whereas the Triton is more of a brand new generation, so therefore it has to have the newer tech. That does impact things a bit in the driving experience, in my opinion, because you've just got to turn off these systems before you even start driving, and that frustrates me a little bit. The D-Max isn't out of this completely though. It does have an annoying lane keep assist system. They've updated it for 2024. So it is a bit more relaxed, not relaxed, but it's a bit more proactive. Instead of just waiting to hit the line, it'll actually sort of read what you're doing a bit better. It does have more comprehensive camera system at the front, that's above the windscreen there, or on the windscreen, sorry. So they have improved it, but it's still a bit annoying. But you've got that button on the steering wheel, you hold it down for 2 or 3 seconds or something, and the whole lane keep assist will turn off. Similar with the Triton, you can turn it off pretty easily. But just in terms of the annoying systems, I think that D-Max wins because it's a bit more old school and it can get away with not having these latest, well, mainly the driver monitoring camera. Now, in terms of driving refinement, for me, the Triton does edge ahead just a little bit. A little bit to do with the engine noise. It's not as loud as the D-Max engine. But also the cabin acoustics with the new design and everything. And there's, premium sort of trim, premium materials and stuff around the place, or more of it. It just seems to absorb the sound, and it just sounds a bit nicer inside when you're having a conversation or something like that. I mean, it doesn't matter too much if you're after a workhorse, then you'll like the D-Max, because it is, it's got a lot more hard plastics and stuff in it. Although in saying that, it's quite nice in upper spec, or the X-Terrain model. It's actually quite nice inside, but I reckon, in my opinion anyway, the Triton just edges ahead with refinement, and even some of the controls, the buttons and stuff, they're just a bit nicer to push, just a bit. As for the handling, look, they're both pretty similar. The D-Max, it handles pretty much like an SUV, really. There's no major body roll or anything like that. The Triton does feel a little bit more like a Ute, just in terms of the handling through the steering and so on. They have reduced the amount of turns lock to lock. It used to be like 50 turns just to do a U-turn. And that's in terms of steering the wheel all the way to the left, all the way to the right. They've reduced that amount of times you need to turn that. Whereas the D-Max has always had a pretty sort of normal SUV style of ratio. The Triton, they've improved that, but it still does feel a little bit like a Ute. You're aware that you're driving a Ute purely through the steering I'm talking about. The suspension is pretty similar in both. You really need to test them both back to back, including myself, to actually come up with a definite conclusion. But just from memory, they're both pretty similar, but I think the D-Max has a slightly better ride. They're really concentrated on that rear suspension, and the leaf suspension in the D-Max. They've got two different configurations. They've got a heavy duty setup for some of the lower spec models, and then the upper spec, like the X-Terrain, has a different setup, which is kind of good, I think. If you're really looking to do heavy duty work and things, you want something that's like a council spec car or something like that, going to be loaded up with all sorts of gear in the back, then the lower spec model is going to be what you're driving, and that's good that they've done that. Whereas the X-Terrain is more of a lifestyle kind of recreational vehicle. They put the more comfortable rear suspension setup, but it still has the good towing and all that, so you don't miss out on anything, but you just get a bit more comfort. And then lastly, we come to warranty. Isuzu offers a 6-year, 150,000 kilometer warranty, whereas the Triton comes with standard 5-year, 100,000. But if you service it at Mitsubishi, you get 10 years warranty and 10 years cap price servicing as well, which is just, that's awesome. To answer that original question, what would be my driveway? It's a very difficult one, but I think the Triton would just get there. Because of that engine, I just find it a little bit more interesting. Again, this is only appeals to me. I know it's not going to appeal to everyone having an interesting engine. But yeah, the twin turbo, a little bit more power, a little bit more torque. Even though it is slower, that's the weird part. Like, it's actually slower than the D-Max. I'd still prefer the Triton because of the engine being a little bit more interesting. Also, the potential to have lower fuel consumption, 10 years warranty, and I think the interior is a bit nicer. Both feature pretty average touchscreens. Isuzu did improve the screen for 2024, so now it's got the volume knobs, and even the screen layout is a bit better. But they're both pretty average in my opinion. I think the Ford Ranger, or actually the Volkswagen Amarok, has the best screen in this class at the moment, in my opinion, because it has the big screen, but it also has the sort of conventional grid layout for all the apps. I like the simplicity of that, just grid layouts for the apps. You don't have some weird menus that have these dead ends and stuff. That's kind of like the Triton and kind of like the D-Max, where it just sort of goes nowhere. But yeah, they're both pretty similar in terms of they're just both pretty average. I do like that the Triton seems to have a few more buttons, physical buttons, so you can just jump to things straight away. And just the interior layout and the design I like a little bit more in the Triton. The exterior of the Triton, I don't really like the front end that much. It looks a bit sort of strange, I guess the best word for it is. But the back of it looks good. It's got this boxy sort of utilitarian look to it. Whereas the D-Max, look, there's nothing wrong with the D-Max design. I mean, it's subjective anyway. Everyone's got their own opinion when it comes to this sort of stuff. They have made some changes or some tweaks for 2024. So it does look a bit edgier. Looks like it's got a bit more attitude, a bit more modern as well. But overall, it's a similar kind of silhouette. It's a D-Max straight away. Whereas the Triton just stands out as something a little bit more futuristic and a little bit different. Keep those questions coming. If you like these videos, I'll do more of them in the future. I'll try and keep them a bit punchier and a bit quicker and go through a few different questions in the same video, as I said. It was just that this is quite detailed, and I think it's a pretty hot topic at the moment, D-Max versus Triton, so I thought I'd better answer it with some detail. Thanks for watching.